Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of TEPAV, we would like to welcome you all to our online panel on the NATO summit and Turkey-US relations. We are happy to see that there is a high level of attendance. We have a very distinguished group here. It's an honor and a true pleasure to have you here. We would like to thank all of you for taking the time to participate in today's panel. We would also like to thank Bülent Yüzda from CSIS for co-hosting and moderating this timely event. Ladies and gentlemen, as wars wage across the globe, NATO held a historic summit in Washington last week celebrating the 75th anniversary of the alliance. Important decisions were taken. At the same time, two important allies, Turkey and US, are going through a difficult period in their bilateral relations. How will we be able to restore trust in our relationship? What are the thorny issues that must be resolved? More importantly, which the upcoming elections in the US, uh, how will it affect our bilateral ties, especially if there is a new administration in the US? Ladies and gentlemen, I would like now give the floor to Bülent Yüzda to introduce our panelists and deliver his remarks. Thank you once again for the attendance. Your microphone is off. Yeah.
Thank you, Ece, and good afternoon to everyone who's joining us in Turkey from CSIS. We're still morning, and from where I have been watching U.S.-Turkish relations for 3 decades. Now, we are going through a difficult period in the relationship between the two countries, but that was almost always the case. It's just the level of the disagreements. I still continue to believe that what unites Turkey and the United States is more than what divides the two countries. We have a very distinguished panel of participants from the U.S. side as well as from the Turkish side, and we'll be looking at the NATO summit and the current state of U.S.-Turkish relations. So thank you all for joining us, both participants and those who are joining us online. And without further ado, I'd like to ask my colleague, Max Bergman, the director of our Europe program here at CSIS, who's been looking quite closely at the NATO summit, to speak for us. Max, please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you, Bülent, and thank you so much for having me. Greetings from Washington, D.C. It's a real pleasure to be with you all and with such esteemed panelists. Sam, good to see you, and also the 3 ambassadors that are on this attending this event as well. Maybe I'll just give a quick overview of kind of how I see how the NATO summit has played out. I think coming in to this summit, there was a lot of concern in Washington about the summit last year in Vilnius, being sort of a divisive summit in which NATO membership for Ukraine was a major topic, in which I think Washington was sort of blindsided by the furor that erupted over Ukraine membership and how strongly it was pushed, not just by Ukraine, but by other NATO members.
Max, we lost you. Maybe we should switch to Sam. Let me see if Max is coming back. Max, are you back?
I am. I'm sorry.
Please go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't know what happened.
Please go ahead.
But in general, this was a summit that was fundamentally about celebrating NATO's 75th birthday. And I think the administration succeeded in making it sort of about NATO as an alliance and the history of that alliance. But that said, it wasn't a transformational summit. This wasn't a summit that sort of plotted a new direction for the alliance. Maybe to run through some of the deliverables. I mean, I think the first thing to kind of remember is that this summit is sort of essentially technocratic in nature. This is sort of a mid-cycle summit in the sense that 2 years ago, NATO agreed in Madrid to a new strategic concept, essentially a new plan for the alliance. And then last year, it agreed to regional plans, essentially the military plans to implement that strategic concept. And this summit is sort of checking in on how we're doing as an alliance in implementing those regional plans. And, we don't really know because it's classified. But, it seems like everyone was quite positive on how the alliance was doing moving forward. The second thing is that the focus on defense spending and that celebrating that more and more countries, more than 20, I think 23 is the number, are hitting 2%. And so that was seen as a real sign of the alliance, getting more serious about defense. When it came to Ukraine, there's a few things to mention. I think it is quite significant, all these bilateral security agreements that were reached with Ukraine, essentially individual NATO members committing to Ukraine security. Turkey was not one of these countries, but that sort of came together in what the White House called the Ukraine Compact. There was tangible assistance in terms of announcements about air defense, F-16s will start flying in Ukraine in the summer. And in the actual communique language, it sort of strengthens it some way by mentioning that this about about a bridge to NATO for Ukraine and about Ukraine membership being irreversible, or Ukraine sort of being clearly on the path to NATO membership. And the fact that Turkey and Hungary and others have signed on to that, I think, is significant. There was a lot of focus on defense industrial production, on ramping up defense industrial production, a few technical deliverables. There's, I think, still a lot of conversation that needs to happen there, particularly between kind of European defense industries and the US. A lot of the announcements, I think, don't really amount to a major structural change, but that was a major focus of the summit. Maybe finally, there was really good language, at least from a Washington perspective, on China, that China is sort of a decisive enabler of the Russian defense industry and therefore is fueling the war effort. I think it was quite significant that, and is being seen as quite significant, particularly by my colleagues that focus on Asia here at CSIS, who are very excited about this language, because it is an indication that that NATO is calling out China. Now, it comes on the heels of Orban and Erdogan and others going to Beijing, but signing on to this language. And so I think the big question going forward is, was this something that it just wasn't worth fighting about? And so countries agreed, or will there be actual follow-on action, particularly at the EU level, but also at the member state level? And maybe finally, my general critique of this summit is that I think Washington had an opportunity to make this a more transformational summit about the future direction of the alliance, obviously with American politics being quite divided about the future of NATO, and there being lots of talk of a quote unquote European pillar of NATO. There's no real sense of what that European pillar means, what that could look like, and there's no sort of long-term plan for how that would be achieved. And I think there was an opportunity with this alliance, with the United States being firmly supportive of NATO, having a very pro-alliance president in Joe Biden, really sort of charting a new course there. Now, I'm a think tanker, so I always have to have some critiques of the administration. So that would be mine, that I think this was essentially a technocratic summit, a birthday party, and didn't really result in the big tangible changes. And I think partly because of that, I think it meant that this was not a summit dominated by Turkey, and by Turkey sort of being front and center and causing, I think, at least many people in various European and North Atlantic capitals heart palpitations, but ended up, pushing on some language, no more than the French or others, and ultimately was I think seen as a rather productive actor in this. But with that, maybe I'll close. Blunt, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks, Max. That was a great sum up. And I'll pass the floor, the internet floor, to Sam Brennan, previously of CSIS, until recently a member of the U.S. government as a Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Defense Department, and now Director of International Security Program at RAND. And Sam, it's nice to be able to participate with you in a seminar yet again. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Bulepe. Thanks to CSIS and TEPAV for the invitation, and really humbled to be with the distinguished panelists today. And Ambassador Richard Doney, nice to see you virtually again. I will say that as a technocrat, and I think Max correctly described the summit as a technocratic achievement, it really was. When you look at the number of issues on which at least incremental progress was made, the fact that there were not any summit blowups or sort of backroom disagreements pouring out into the public, it was really masterfully done. There were no enormous deliverables. There was nothing really for the history books coming out of this. But I think if this is a trajectory that NATO is on and it can stick on, we really are at probably one of the strongest points in the alliance, with a few outliers. And the outliers are probably Turkey and Hungary more than anything. And I think others will get more into why Turkey may not have seen this as so productive a summit. But from a US perspective, and I think from a European perspective broadly, a couple of things come to mind. First is we're now NATO at 32, and Sweden and Finland joining and really being at the table fully integrated this year is a huge achievement and victory, and something that frankly would have been unthinkable before the Russian further invasion of Ukraine. So it creates real problems for Russia going forward in terms of the border that it now has to manage from an alliance perspective. That makes Putin's life more difficult, not less difficult. And so certainly, I don't think in Moscow this would have been viewed as a summit with any favor to Russian interests. The other piece, of course, was the language that was a bit settling, but again avoided public confrontation on unwavering commitment to Ukraine and all of the bilateral agreements that went with that. And irreversible. A lot of the language was stronger outside of the official documents in terms of what heads of state were able to say. But I think the other piece of it is when you look at the number of arms transfers that happened between last summit and this summit, whether it's ATACMS and other long-range strike capabilities, F-16s, a lot of the previous red lines and what NATO allies, in particular the US, was unwilling to give, has moved forward. A lot of quiet arms transfers from Germany and others that have also moved forward in recent weeks. And so even though the campaign on the ground is not gone in Ukraine's favor the last year, it sets more favorable conditions going forward. And again, if you're Russia, you've got to be worried about what that means for you. You're more focused on political commitment than you are on defense industrial commitment. I think Russia is resigned at this point to understanding that NATO will continue to supply the armaments that Ukraine needs to stay in the war, and they're going to increasingly target the political commitment of various neighbors. And notably, of course, we've had some election outcomes in the UK and France that suggest staying power for some key European countries to be determined in the US. And I'm sure others will get into the election year politics. The other piece that's really important from a US perspective, and I think from a NATO alliance perspective, is the strong language, in particular on China, but also on the DPRK, North Korea, that is, and Iran, in terms of NATO calling out the destabilizing influence, the threat of arms transfers to the Russians, in some of the strongest language we've seen, certainly on China, as Max said. And I think the pointed connection that has been drawn by the Secretary General, among others, of saying that essentially she could make one phone call and end the conflict in Ukraine is a powerful statement. And coming from Europe, again, a year ago, we wouldn't have seen that kind of language. Today we are. And then the final piece, which Max alluded to as well, was the defense industrial language. Again, I think the proof will be in the actual outputs of the agreements, but a lot of agreements signed. The Deputy Secretary of Defense gave a speech that was very closely followed in Washington, in which she said the arsenal of democracy is global, and really pushed for longer-term commitments by governments and more joint production between NATO allies, among others, moving forward. So again, we'll see if the defense industry actually picks that up. But I think one of the biggest changes from a Pentagon perspective coming out of Ukraine has been the sharp focus on U.S. defense industrial capacity, and that is across alliances. We're having conversations here and certainly in other NATO capitals on what a defense industrial base needs to look like to be credible moving forward against a range of adversaries, and that was advanced through the summit. A few other areas just to highlight, which is I think on the area of nuclear deterrence, again, often highly controversial in an alliance context. We have some of the strongest language, frankly, from the Cold War in terms of what allies are prepared to do in properly posturing and potentially modernizing the nuclear enterprise and integrating that into planning that's ongoing. Space and cyberspace, the same, doubling down on those domains as areas where NATO will further integrate between allies. And of course, mention of other regions that extended specifically, I think, from a Turkish perspective, interest in a designation potentially of a special representative for the southern neighborhood, as it's referred to in the NATO summit statement, and the opening of a new NATO liaison center in Jordan as well. So not ignoring the Middle East and not ignoring Africa. That said, I think the backdrop, of course, and an issue that did not come up on which I think there's real fragmentation among allies is the current situation in Gaza. And frankly, the fact that NATO is really not a player in that. We have some multilateral engagement with the US, but that's under strain given domestic politics, particularly in the UK after the election. And so watching what NATO will do when it comes to Gaza moving forward, I think probably from a US perspective, NATO is not part of the planning and factoring there as it might have been an out of area operations pre-Ukraine. Another big issue that is a win for the United States, and again, I think for NATO broadly, is the invitation of Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and the Republic of Korea, and some really serious meetings about what cooperation would mean there, about the potential of more of a NATO permanent presence, not expansion, but presence at least politically, possibly in Seoul, South Korea, if not elsewhere. And so from a US perspective, again, really good news story that the alliance is relevant to its other global interests, particularly in Asia, relevant to defense industrial capacity potentially. And then I think a lot of highlighting in President Biden's remarks and others about the dramatic increase in the number of NATO members that are now spending 2% or more of GDP. And again, on the technocratic side, a lot of new commitments for NATO allies to live up to some of the new capabilities and plans, benchmarks that have been drawn up by SHAPE in terms of advancing national commitments. And one sidebar issue there is that in the midst of this, the Army announced that it will be rotating forward starting in 2026, some of its most advanced long-range strike capabilities. So making clear that even as the United States is very focused on China, it's going to take some of its highest end capabilities and force elements and put them in Europe on a rotational presence. So there was not a drawdown, there was not a sort of self-congratulatory tone in Washington about where we were with Ukraine, but there's a commitment to continue to really push forward in spending and commitments, and even in forces that'll be put forward. So look forward to hearing how it might have been viewed from Ankara and elsewhere. But I think from a Washington perspective, frankly, it was a summit that may not have had huge headlines, but I think broadly viewed as a success. And certainly if it's a waypoint on a trajectory that continues, it's on an upward path. But again, subject to a lot of things that may happen between now and when the summit reconvenes a year from now.
Thanks, Sam. It was a great explanation of what happened here at the summit from the U.S. perspective. And know that there'll be some questions from the participants. But now we go straight to Ambassador Hussein Dirias, who who served as Deputy Secretary General of NATO and previously in Washington, having held a number of ambassadorial positions afterwards, serves as DCM in Washington and really understands the U.S. perspective. But please give us the Turkish perspective of the summit and broaden the discussion to U.S.-Turkish relations, its impact on U.S.-Turkish relations that we'll pick up with Ambassador Ricciardoni and Ambassador Lolo. The floor is yours, Ambassador De Rios.
Thank you very much, sir. Now I open the audio. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to address distinguished group of audience and other speakers who are very distinguished also. Now, going to Turkey's impact or NATO summit's impact on Turkey, or how it would be or should be evaluated. First of all, the fact that the summit was held and robust, even though it was a kind of, how should I say, technical summit, let's say, not a very critical summit, but nevertheless, NATO's principal philosophy is deterrence and defense. And at the end of the Cold War, we added cooperative security and crisis management and now prevention as well. But basically, it's deterrence and defense. And I always say deterrence comes before defense. So if you are successful at deterrence, you don't have to defend or fight. Deterrence is so important. And we always say, as defense planners or whole mill people, deterrence has two elements. One is the capabilities, tanks, missiles, etc. And the other is political will. And political will is manifested through such communiques, ministerial or summit communiques. So the fact that this summit was held and came with a robust communique is already positive, also for Turkey, because it shows the strength and unity of the alliance at a time when there were questions in the minds of others whether there was some kind of, how should I say, differences among allies, and Western solidarity, NATO solidarity was being weakened. Now, this is after Ukraine. Of course, the unity was again restored, and such summits now also show that there is more unity of purpose and solidarity among NATO members. So that's the first positive thing. Of course, as mentioned by Mr. Brennan, designation of a special representative for South and Southeastern periphery or countries is important also for Turkey, because Turkey is in that area. But more importantly for Turkey, I may add 5 points from the communique as well. One is about the defense industrial cooperation, because from time to time there are impediments or there are limitations put to Turkey and defense cooperation with Turkey. So this is a positive step in the right direction, or in the direction that Turkey would have wanted. So I consider it as a positive step on against such limitations from time to time Turkey sees on defense industry area from some of its allies. Second is about the terrorism. The statements on the communique on terrorism, they are a repetition of the previous determination on combating terrorism on its all in its all manifestations, but nevertheless, its repetition and its reconfirmation is also a positive factor for Turkey, who also is very sensitive to such threats. A third point, again, is a repetition from previous communiques, but NATO-EU relations, where it is clearly specified that the non-EU European countries' participation's importance is highlighted. So that's also a positive step towards Turkey. We hope that it moves even further than that eventually, but this also is considered as a positive step. Another point is when the communique refers to the Black Sea security, there's a confirmation of the importance of the Montreux Treaty of 1936. So that's I consider as a positive step and point. And perhaps finally, I should say the next summit will be held in Netherlands, but the one after that is indicated to be held in Turkey. The year is not set. It's 20, maybe because normally every 2 years there's a summit, but because of the situation in Ukraine now, every year sometimes summit happens. So we don't know whether it will be in 26 or 27, but nevertheless, it's in line now because the last summit in Turkey was in 2004. So that's also kind of enhances the ownership in Turkey of NATO and NATO-related activities and pertaining to the Western security system and Western system in general, because it is one of the key connections for Turkey between Turkey and the Western allies, friends, partners, in addition to Council of Europe. We have not made progress in the EU field. We are, in a sense, stagnated there, but that's also the ambition. And this ambition comes not only, it dates back to even earlier times when the Turks or even the Ottomans missed the modernization, Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, and therefore they declined. Then they saw as remedy to catch up with the West. They made Reformation movements in 19th century and changed the nature of the schools, universities along the Western lines. And Ataturk and the Republic brought this even to a higher level and better level. So Turkey, not geographical West, but in terms of contemporary civilization catching up with the West was always ambition of the Turkish state in a sense. And therefore, joining NATO was also not only a threat from Russia or Soviets at the time and strategic considerations, but also it's a continuation of that general trend in Turkish psyche and statecraft in a sense. Where does this affect Turkish-American relations? I think the effect should be positive, at least not negative, and it's not having a not negative effect is already positive enough under the circumstances, if I may be a bit cynical. So that's how I look at it in short. But I mean, I don't know whether I exceeded my limit or not because I can speak. Well,
You're broadening. You're
sorry.
broadening the discussion. Sorry, Ambassador Diaz, you're broadening the discussion into U.S.-Turkish relations. So say a few words about U.S.-Turkish relations before we proceed to Ambassador Richard Doney and Ambassador Lawler. Please, go ahead.
Yes, as I said, Turkey's ambition was to go towards Western countries, to be part of the West. It was a founding member of Council of Europe at the end of the Second World War, and it was a NATO member. It became a NATO member under threat, but also under this trend. It was a good member. But in the 60s, with the Cyprus issue came out and President Johnson's letter, the famous one, but not only that, but also after the Cuban crisis, when the world came so close to a nuclear catastrophe, then the process of détente has started. Some allies, European allies like Germany, took it even further to Ostpolitik levels. And at that time, Turkey also diversified its relations and even had relations with Soviet Union at the time and investments from there, but never losing its footing firmly in the West and in NATO, because NATO is the most concrete connection of Turkey to the West and therefore to United States. Because then I will jump to another debate about the European security and defense identity, which is fine, good. But at the strategic level, the North American connection is indispensable for NATO's effectiveness. And almost everybody knows this. So That's why when I say NATO, also it means relations with the US. And Turkey diversified its relations, but again, its relations with NATO and with US continued solidly. Then came the end of the Cold War. End of the Cold War, of course, Turkey had some relations with the Russians, but it's like the Germans, or in this respect, like-minded states, meaning in respect to cooperative security with Russians or detente period. In those respects, Turkey, Germany, Italy, France were kind of like-minded states. Not on every issue, of course, as you obviously know, but in this aspect, they were like-minded, and therefore there was this energy ties, etc., with Russia, but at the same time, never losing its firm footing in NATO and its relations with its allies, including first and foremost United States as an ally. And even on Ukraine, Russia issue, some say Turkey, where does it stand? They say Turkey has a balanced policy. It may be balanced, but it's not impartial. Turkey undersigned this, is a NATO member. It also undersigns these NATO communiques, and there's harsh and firm criticism of what Russia is doing and has done. So Turkey always understands that. So there should, I mean, sometimes there's the impression that Turkey may be jumping from this side to that side, but normally it is firmly grounded and should continue to be like that, to be firmly grounded in the Western institutions and NATO. And I think by undersigning this communique, yet another manifestation of this policy, I should say.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Dirios, and thank you for stressing the one unchanged factor in U.S.-Turkish relations, which is the NATO membership of Turkey, which is now 73 years old, which is the main binding link between the two countries, as well as with the other members of the Atlantic Alliance. We'll now cross to Ambassador Richardoni, who served as ambassador in Turkey, and ask him to pick up from where Ambassador Dirios left off. How strong is the Turkish relationship with NATO, and of course the United States as the leader of NATO. So welcome to the webinar, Ambassador Richardoni. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bülent and CSIS and TEPAV for bringing us together today. And it really is a special pleasure to be with not only old colleagues, but friends, like Hussein and Farouk and yourself and Dan. Thank you. I have to imagine, I was not there in the corridors, but I have to imagine that all the corridor or much of the corridor conversation was about U.S. politics and what's happening in the United States, what will happen in the elections, and a very keen look at President Biden to understand what's going to happen in the United States. Not only is he up to the job, but what will the American people think, and how will things go here? Everyone arrived in Washington right at the moment when the big question is, will the Biden candidacy continue in U.S. politics? And if not, what happens then? There have been, of course, the foreign leaders who came were all very judicious in their comments. They had to be careful, but still, it was quite clear that there seems to be a consensus of concern that Biden, if he stands as a candidate, might not win. And if he doesn't, what then for NATO and relations with the U.S.? That was quite a challenging period for most countries in their bilateral relationships, and for NATO in its relationships with the United States under the Trump administration. And if we have a new Trump administration refreshed with a validation of the mandate to make America great again more unilaterally, with less dependence on its alliance commitments, or less commitment even to its alliance commitments, then we may be in for a wild ride. To say all that is pretty banal, actually. It's not a particularly keen insight, but from what I take away from reporting on the summit, that was a pretty big underlying factor that everyone was concerned about. That said, Biden seems to have acquitted himself as well as could be expected, and as well as ever. He clearly is an internationalist. He has a strong team around him that understands all the verities of statecraft from the Cold War and post-Cold War era going forward. I choose to be optimistic about the United States and its role in NATO, I have to confess, some anxieties about it if we go into a second Trump administration. All of us in this conversation, at least on the screen, are creatures of what the Trump people call the deep state, and what even Obama called the swamp in Washington. Whether it's the establishment, the foreign policy establishment, internationalists, people who believe that what made America great, or makes America great in the present tense, is, in fact, its multifaceted relationships, give and take, cooperative relationships with other countries and with other multilateral institutions in the world. That internationalism itself is under attack from left and right, hence even the Obama reticence in a couple of speeches you can point to. And on the progressive side of American politics, so-called progressive side, about globalism, etc. America has been reassessing its place in the world, I would submit, not only since the end of the Cold War, but since the post-Iraq period, when Obama came in, and in a big way with Trump. So we'll see what happens in November. If indeed the Biden or another Democrat wins, I think it's safe to say we'll be much more in the customary internationalist camp that everybody understands. The apparatus of American engagement with NATO and bilaterally with the world, particularly with Turkey, will be there, whether the military establishment, the diplomatic establishment, the law enforcement establishment, the intelligence establishment, the media, the think tanks. We all know each other and have been doing business with each other on the basis of well understood national and shared priorities for a long time. And I think that will persist, assuming Biden or another Democrat is elected. And even if President Trump is elected again, for all the disruption that we experienced during his administration in NATO and in international affairs, still, America's ties with NATO more than withstood that. It remained quite strong. America's ties, relations with Turkey, arguably, in some ways, there seems to have been a warmer personal relationship between President Erdogan and President Trump than has been the case with now President Biden and President Erdogan. So I dare hope it's more hope than faith, I would say, that the establishment that many of the Trump camp have explicitly targeted as needing reform, the defense establishment, the intelligence establishment, the diplomatic establishment, the media, the think tanks. I hope that the resilience of that establishment will once again prove there. And, America refreshes itself through these elections. Oxygen comes into the system. Oxygen can be explosive, but it is also refreshing. And I choose to be optimistic that even in a Trump administration, U.S. will remain an important supporter, not a problem for NATO, but an important linchpin of NATO, and that U.S.-Turkish ties will be no more troubled than they are now, and might even in some ways find a new pretext, at least, for a path forward in some of the areas that Hussein, you mentioned from the NATO statement, like defense industrial cooperation, and other areas as well, especially in trade. Let me leave it there. That's enough speculation and punditry.
Thanks, Frank. And I forgot to mention that Ambassador Ricciardone, in addition to participating in many events at CSIS on U.S.-Turkish relations, also opened the U.S. Center at TEPAV. I was there with the former Foreign Minister, Ambassador Yaşar Yakış, who passed away recently. So he's very well qualified to look at the relationship in many senses, in addition to having been an ambassador. We are getting some questions, and we'll go to them after the presentations. And last but not least, we have Ambassador Faruk Loğlu, who served as a Turkish ambassador to the United States, and he will be looking at the NATO summit as well as on the current and future state of U.S.-Turkish relations. Ambassador Loğlu, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bülent Ali Rıza, and thank you, TEPAV, for organizing this meeting. And hello to friends, old and new. I'm joining you from Bodrum, where it's hot. We are really facing a meltdown, but I'm still here. Thank you. To clarify my take on NATO, I have three caveats. One is that I'm not a NATO specialist. The other is I'm not a NATO fan. But number three, despite my trepidations, I believe NATO is still a viable alliance, and Turkey's national security depends on it. And that NATO umbrella also releases huge domestic resources for Turkey, which can be used, if properly, for the welfare and prosperity of its people. So Turkey must act in consonance with the terms of membership in the NATO alliance. A few comments on the NATO summit. The North Atlantic Treaty begins with the following commitments, and I quote, "The parties to this treaty reaffirm their faith in the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and their desire to live in peace with all peoples and all governments." And the term peace is repeated many times throughout the text of the treaty. But the 11-page long Washington Summit Declaration, the emphasis is, however, on armaments, on threats to security and enemies of the alliance, and there is scant embrace of the terms of peace and of peaceful relations. Sure, NATO is a defensive alliance, but the declaration's tone is overwhelmingly aggressive. The focus on Ukraine is understandable, but there too, the emphasis is more on prolonging the war, not on ending it. I'm sure there is also a NATO explanation for why the Israeli-Palestinian war is not even mentioned in 11 pages. But whatever the reason, I think it's a shame that the Palestinian-Gaza war was not mentioned in some ways. All in all, I'm disappointed and disillusioned with the conclusions of the summit. At its 75th anniversary, NATO should have sent out a more soothing, a more calming message to a troubled global system. But I think NATO missed this chance. On Turkish-American relations, I'll be even briefer. the prospect of any sustained movement forward in Turkish-American relations is dim at best. Why so? Because there are daunting problems, bilateral problems, regional problems, and global issues that separate the two sides, and there is not enough shared will to make things better. The underlying fault line is the lack of mutual trust and the reciprocal inability or unwillingness to recognize the importance of this relationship. To be more concrete, let me just say the following. If President Biden is re-elected, we'll be facing a stagnant period in our relations, given his long-standing negative political stance toward Turkey, heavily shaped by the Armenian and Greek lobbies, especially in the current absence of the traditional support provided by the Jewish lobby for Turkish causes. And this, of course, is a consequence of the state of Turkish-Israeli relations at the moment. During Biden's presidency, if re-elected, there may be a few tidbits to keep up the appearance of an allied relationship, but nothing major should be expected. If former President Trump is back in office, and I think his chances appear to have improved after the recent assassination attempt on his life, the Turkish-American relationship will face, to put it mildly, an unpredictable future with sharp ups and downs. How the final balance will turn out is anybody's guess. It can be positive, it can be negative, but I think it will be, it's just anybody's guess. In conclusion, the US must demonstrate that Turkey is a friend and an ally. On the Turkish side, there is not enough investment in a real reset of our ties with the US. So I'm rather pessimistic on both accounts, both NATO's posture in the rapidly changing international environment and on the near future of Turkish-American relations. I apologize for my pessimism, but that's the way it goes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lawler. And before going to questions, I have to ask the American participants at this time to pick up on some of the points that Ambassador Lawler made, and whether you share his pessimism. But please, Ambassador Dirias wants to speak. Go ahead, sir.
Just since our American colleagues are going to respond to Ambassador and Deputy Lawler, I just wanted to raise one point, very recent. The designation of Mr. Vance as vice presidential candidate for Mr. Trump, does it also add to this picture of, how should I say, not only in Turkish-US relations, but US-European relations, or US, would it raise any new thoughts or ideas, if I may say? Thank you.
Please go ahead. Anybody on the American side, please. Go ahead, Max.
Well, I can start and then pass it off to Sam and the ambassador. So I guess maybe on the just a few points on the NATO communique, not articulating sort of a peace message. I think the fact is that NATO countries feel at threat, and that Russia has invaded and is occupying a neighboring state, had invaded without cause, and is continuing to pummel Ukrainian cities, Ukrainian infrastructure, and just before the summit took place, deliberately bombed a children's cancer hospital. So the idea that the summit would sort of, just sort of say, well, we want peace, I think sort of belies the reality is that we're dealing with a very hostile state. And we just ran essentially an 8-month experiment of what would happen if the United States cut off aid to Ukraine. And it didn't bring Russia to the negotiating table. In fact, it led Vladimir Putin to double down on his maximalist war aims. Russia has been engaged right now in a 6-month or 8-month long ground assault, including opening another front in the north in Kharkiv, is using glide bombs, which are essentially old Dun bombs that you attach fins onto it so it can cause mass devastation especially to trenches and to cities and to urban infrastructure. And that's the current reality that Ukraine faces, is that they're now facing a very dark winter because of the attacks on their infrastructure. So I just think the reality is that we're not at peace, and this is not a summit that can sort of wish away what is actually happening on the ground. So I think the support for Ukraine is very strong. And then maybe just a point on defense industrial cooperation. This is where I think Turkey is going to be frozen out because of, in some ways, I would argue, a hedging strategy, which eventually leads to a lack of trust here in Washington, but also amongst European capitals. And when we think about the EU defense industrial base, the European defense industrial base, one of the challenges, I think, and this is true in Washington, that we are looking at, well, what happens if the Europeans tomorrow agree to use their currency, which they could easily do, and this is something that we've been harping on here at CSIS, and they had a meeting, a European Council meeting to, in fact, discuss this. And there's, it's getting to almost be universal support for it. Germany is still holding out, but to issue Eurobonds, which would be potentially hundreds of billions of euros then into defense to create a common pot for both Ukraine and for defense industrial production. Now that's going to go to European producers. And the big question, I think, right now for the UK is, can it be considered part of this? And that's what Labour, I think, is going to negotiate. But the EU will start with, if it agrees to this, and it may never happen. But I do think that if Donald Trump is elected, it's quite likely that this will happen because there'll need to be a massive injection of funding to potentially take into account the U.S. pulling back. And I don't think Turkey is going to be part of that, in part because there's a lack of trust. Now, you could argue that that's Washington's fault or it's the fault of various European capitals. But at the end of the day, when you buy Russian systems, S-400, that then leads to a lack of trust. And so I think that's and when you're trusted with the most advanced technology, both on the US and European side, there has got to be a trust of how that equipment and how that technology is going to be treated. So I think I share the ambassador's view that perhaps U.S.-Turkish relations are rather dim. I do think that a Biden reelection will I think, cause somewhat of a reset. There's no more waiting to see what happens in November. And so they can perhaps come to terms and set a clear course. But I think the problem for Turkey, I think, is that by hedging, and you could argue that's the right strategy from a Turkish perspective, but it frankly makes Turkey not seem like as a dependable an ally. And you could argue that that's not how the United States should feel, but I think that's the reality of what's happening in Washington, and then makes it Washington, and I think in Brussels and other European capitals, less willing to move in Turkish directions or make certain compromises.
I'm going to come to you, but before I do so, I just want to remind everybody that it was when Donald Trump was president that Turkey was pushed out of the F-35 program at the instigation of the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress, again, during the Trump presidency, accepted the Armenian genocide resolution. And also Turkey cuts of sanctions were imposed on Turkey. So even if Trump is elected, I don't anticipate an improved relationship, which Ambassador Lowell rightly underlined. Sam, what's the U.S. government, of which you were a part until recently, perspective on Turkey's reliability question, which Max just raised?
So I will certainly not speak for the current U.S. government, but I will say, I think Ambassador Lolu raises a very good point, which is that Turkey's current strategy is to ride the currents of multipolarity more or less in its position, geography, and economy, which is that you want to get Turkey wants to get along with Iran. It wants to get along with China. It wants to get along with Russia. It wants to get along with the United States. It wants to get along with Europe. And we're at a fracturing point in the international system where that's not a viable strategy, and people are picking sides, and that puts Turkey in a really tough position. And so I think the fact that NATO chose sides effectively at this summit is not a good outcome for Turkey's strategy. I think it is a dim outlook for U.S.-Turkey relations if Turkey does not adapt and evolve the strategy in some way. And I think just being an obstacle to change, or trying to be its own sort of peacemaker, doing things differently. Again, I just don't think Turkey has the national strength independently at this moment. It's going to have to align itself one way or the other, or really take a position of greater neutrality, which is going to, I think, diminish its voice. So, I mean, if I were advising on what a Turkish strategy would be, is it's sort of you have to choose. Are you aligning with the Eurasian option, or are you staying put in the alliance? Because I think it becomes more uncomfortable by the day to try to hedge those two things. And I think from a U.S. perspective, I think Turkey is viewed as very unreliable. I think there's a desire always to work with Turkey and to keep Turkey on side. But I think there's more of an appetite, and as Bulenpe said, particularly in the Congress, to take a harder line. I think Washington is in a confrontational mood, both internally and externally, and that's a dangerous time to be in a position where you're not strategically aligned with the United States, because I think the United States is increasingly, whatever political party is in power, going to bring its strength to bear when it needs to, in the ways that it thinks it needs to. And people who are off sides with that, I think, will feel a little bit more friction than they have in past administrations, particularly when it comes to Turkey, where there was more, I would say, strategic patience.
Ambassador Ricciardone, you were there during the Obama years, which in retrospect looks like a second honeymoon in U.S.-Turkish relations. Would you like to pick up on some of the points that Ambassador Lowell made from the U.S. perspective?
Yeah, I see really a pretty strong consensus here among all of us. I share Ambassador Lowell's pessimism that the relationship will get much better. As you pointed out, Farouk, there just isn't the will on both sides that would be necessary, to take the relationship further, the interest, the perception of the importance of each side. Well, I didn't mean to sound like a sunny-eyed optimist. I am optimistic that relations probably won't get much worse if the establishment prevails in a Trump administration. That is to say, people who can say, look at the map, look at America's core interests, look at NATO in collective defense, in all the political coordination even we do through NATO. Look at the map, look at Turkey's role there. Whether Turkey is cooperative or not, whatever things they say that might outrage us, or different constituencies among us, if we're going to operate in northern Iraq, in northern Syria, if we're going to be concerned about the stability of that part of the world, we need to have an ability at least to treat Turkey as a partner that disappoints more than it thrills us, rather than an adversary. And it's better to have Turkey in the tent than outside. That's what I mean by saying I see a certain reality that punches through ideology or political sort of campaign talk on either side. That doesn't make me an optimist. We're not going to go back to that golden era where, a new President Obama in his first whatever it is, 5 months in office, goes to Turkey to give a major foreign policy speech. That's not going to happen. I think the scales have fallen from American eyes as to Turkey as a leader of the Muslim world that can sort of westernize the rest of the Muslim world, or something that Obama evidently had in mind. Those days are past. We all had the privilege of serving in a golden era of Turkish-American relations, when The success of what was then seen as a Turkish model was on everyone's lips. Here is a country, a Muslim majority country that seems to make that is a true democracy and it's finding its way and could be an example that the rest of the the Muslim world and even the Arab world could draw lessons from. I think all those sorts of dreams are set aside now, and I wouldn't expect any of that to persist. So it's going to be tough. You know, Ambassador Flake has a tough row to hoe there. And we wish the new Turkish ambassador in Washington, our former colleague, every success. It's going to remain tough, I think, for the diplomats on both sides. They'll still have a lot to work with in terms of core national interests that hopefully will prevail as different issues come up. No one's ever. We're just going to have to manage, as we always have, the various sources of heartburn in the relationship, you know, that have always been there, and the new ones that will come up. I can imagine some big issues coming, things that have always been set aside in the too hard pile. You know, what's Incirlik all about in this day and age? American troop presence abroad for a long time. That, you know, it is a kind of Cold War relic, and it's a shell of its former self in terms of the U.S. presence there. What about nukes in Incirlik? That's, you know, all classified information, but it's an open secret about, you know, obsolete nuclear weapons being stationed there. That's been in the too hard pile to touch for a long time. Would it be a big thing to have another dramatic change in the status of you know, that sort of thing can come up, and probably should, quite honestly, whether it's a Trump administration or a Biden one. It doesn't mean that the Turkey is going to reassess its interest in the West and suddenly turn and I think take a radical departure from where it is now in terms of balancing its interests. And as exasperated as the American electorate might be in terms of America's role in the world, there has to be an American conversation, an American democracy somehow on America's role in the world. What is the benefit of all these international organizations like NATO and even broader, farther afield, the WTO and, you know, the United Nations and all the different organizations we're in? Even in a Trump presidency, a more unilateralist presidency, that doesn't represent the totality of American views. American business has interests that are multilateral. Even American agriculture, the rural sector in the United States, has international interests, as the late Senator Lugar pointed out to me. So I choose to be optimistic that there won't be a disaster. Put it that way. But I'm pessimistic that we'll ever see anything like the golden age or a great revitalization of the Turkish-American relationship or the American-NATO sort of relationship with the Turkish element of it.
10 minutes before we wind up, so let me get to the questions. One of them relates to the reference to the Montreal Convention and the controversial part of, I think it was Article 31 of the Declaration that says where appropriate with reference to the Montreal Convention. That's caused discussion in Turkey. So please speak up on that on the American side, participants, please. And the second one relates to the cooperation with Israel, which on his return to Turkey, President Erdogan said that Turkey would not allow. And the third one that I'll throw out relates to Ukraine. If Trump is elected, what will that do to the declarations that were made at the summit? So any of you, please, on the U.S. side.
Well, I'll go ahead quickly. I think I missed the second question, but on the Montreal Convention, I think I'm not an expert on whether Turkey's enforcement of this is to judge it. I think, you know, on the one hand, it's beneficial for Ukraine that Russian warships are not able to enter. On the other hand, I do understand that if you're Romania and Bulgaria and you have drones and missiles flying off your coast, that you have Russian-laid sea mines that are penetrating your sea space, and that the inability to bring in other NATO ships is somewhat problematic, or more than somewhat problematic. But when it comes to Ukraine under a Trump administration, and this gets to the ambassador's question about J.D. Vance, who made a point of, when he was at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, of highlighting that there would be a lack of support for Ukraine going forward, and that essentially sort of articulating in clearer terms, I think, the broader Trump vision of wanting to pull back from NATO. And there's been reporting recently that Trump would sort of demand a peace plan right away. I think what we'll see is a lot of the U.S. not pass an additional supplemental for Ukraine. So the money that was passed earlier this year, which, one thing I should note, is the beginning of the summit, or 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, the White House was actually very worried this would be a crisis summit. This would be a summit in which Russians were making major gains on the ground, territorial gains, and that Ukraine would be on the cusp of collapsing because of U.S. support. That's not the case. But we're going to replay this again next year, potentially, under Donald Trump. And the question is, will Europe be able to fill the gap? And I think the answer is not right away. But I don't think that U.S. efforts to negotiate a peace here are going to result in anything. But I think you'll see the U.S. Sort of pull back and cut off Ukraine if Donald Trump were to win.
Comment briefly before we go finally to our Turkish participants. Sam, would you like to comment briefly before we go to our Turkish participants to wrap up?
No, thanks. I think Max hit it on the head.
Yeah. Which one you want, Ukraine or Montreux, or both? Can you hear me? I can't.
Sorry, I apologize. I muted myself. The question I'll throw out to you and to Ambassador Lowell is that Turkey is maintaining good relations with Putin and Russia, with Xi Jinping and China, and somewhat of a relationship with Iran next door. Could Turkey, given the fact that all three countries were identified as foes by the NATO summit, could Turkey maintain those relationships at a time when the lines between the West, led by NATO, and those countries are drawn more sharply than before?
From my point of view, since Turkey has undersigned this communique also, then it says that my primary attention, relation, and anchoring point is NATO and the West. And within that, like the Germans said, Ostpolitik, etc., other NATO countries which are firmly grounded in NATO, we can also deal with these other countries, but without endangering or weakening firm being anchored in the West. At least that's what it should be. But the understanding in this communique gives that indication to me that they have not opposed such language against China, against Russia, against whoever. So that's how I see. But I don't know, Ambassador. I always used to get my instructions from him when he was undersecretary, so I should defer to him, if I may.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador de Rios. And Ambassador Lowell, you have the final word.
Well, thank you very much, Bülent Bey. On the Montreux Convention, if I were in the Turkish delegation, I would have advised my delegation to avoid any mention of the Montreux Convention in a NATO summit declaration. It's an international instrument, and given the long tirade against Russia, well placed. I'm not saying that Russia should not be blamed. Russia should be blamed. But I think given a NATO twinge to the Montreux Convention was uncalled for. On Turkey's relations with Russia, China, and Iran, I think Turkey should not only sustain this good relations with the three powers, Turkey must is obliged, in fact, is obliged to maintain these good relations with these three powers. And my point is, good relations of Turkey with China, Russia, and Iran are not a liability for NATO. It's an asset. It's an asset. I think NATO should be very, in a sense, grateful for one of its members that will have a channel of dialogue with Russia, with China, and with Iran, especially Iran. So I think all in all, Turkey's good relations and approach to these countries, which I hope will continue, should be viewed not as a liability, but as an asset for NATO overall. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all the participants and to all those who followed the webinar. And thank you for TEPAV for cooperating with us here at CSIS in putting this together. And so I think it was a very successful seminar. And again, thank you all.